Today we will be in Esther chapter 3. Esther chapter 3, or at least we'll start there. We're going to go to Esther chapter 9. But Esther chapter 3 is our beginning point on page 332. 332 if you're using one of the Pew Bibles. I've noted many times, of course, that the feast that we're going to cover today, Purim, is not one of the feasts that is commanded by God in the Bible. It is rather a feast that Israel celebrated as a result, technically, of what God did in the book of Esther. And if we were to try and summarize the book of Esther, I believe we might be able to summarize it in this way, that though God may be invisible, his hand is formidable. In other words, God is not mentioned at all in the book of Esther. You do not run across the name God or Lord in any form or fashion in the book of Esther. However, the movement and the evidence of God's working permeates every page. Maybe not in the fashion you and I expect it to, but it is there. And thus, I'd like us to read chapter 3 kind of to provide the backstory about why the Feast of Purim came about, understanding the originality of it. And then when we get to chapter 9, we'll see the actual feast institution. So, if you'll follow along, I'm going to read verses 1 through 13 of Esther chapter number 3. And then when I'm done doing that, I'm going to summarize the chapters in between. Esther 3:1 says, let me see if I can do this. There we go. Esther 3:1, and after these things, let me see if I can figure out how to go back now. That's going to be the hard part. There we go. All right, after these things did King Ahasuerus, he's also known by the name Xerxes I, promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate, bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now, it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone. For they had showed him the people of Mordecai, wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. In the first month, that is the month Nisan, the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, that is the lot. And that's where the name Purim comes from. P-U-R, meaning lots. The dice that I think I mentioned it last week or the week before, the taking of dice and kind of casting them out to determine something, a lot like our flipping a quarter today or something like flipping a coin today kind of thing. The I-M of Purim is simply plural. So pure is lot, Purim is lots. So it's just the plural word. So they cast Pur, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day and from month to month to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. In other words, they cast lots to determine when they would eliminate the Jews. Would it be on the first day of the month, second day of the month, third day of the month, and whatever the lot fell on a specific day, and they cast it for the month. Okay, which month is it going to be? And it fell on the 12th month. Verse 8. And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom. And their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws, therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. In other words, to let them live. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that that have the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring. Oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong button somehow. All right, I'm not sure why we're going backwards all of a sudden. Let me try this. There we go, verse 10. I don't know why it did whatever it did. And the king took his ring from his hand, and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. All right, we're going backwards again, so I guess I got to go to this page. Sorry. I told you it was going to be a little tricky here. Verse 12, and it looks like it cut that off, so I'll have to figure that out. So I told you there were going to be bumps in the road, so I apologize that it's bumpy. Verse 12, then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month. There was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus was it written and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by posts into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. That is chapter 13. When we get into chapter 4, it tells us about how Mordecai seeks the assistance of Esther. Mordecai being, of course, the uncle of Esther, and he goes, Esther now being the queen, and he goes to Esther and he seeks her assistance in getting to the king to reverse this and stop this order. Chapter 5 then goes on to tell about the first banquet that Esther prepares. And at the end of that chapter, it tells us about how Haman has now prepared gallows in which he plans to hang Mordecai. Chapter 6, of course, tells us about the king's sleepless night that we heard about a couple weeks ago. And then his command to honor to honor Mordecai at the hand of Haman. Chapter 7 tells us about the second banquet of Esther, where she reveals to the king the plot of Haman, and how Haman is then subsequently hung on his own gallows. Chapter 8 then tells us about Mordecai's promotion to Haman's position, and how he and Esther go to work. And they send out this decree to all the land about how reversing this and really saying to the Jews, saying, you're allowed to fight and defend yourself. If people rise up to kill you, you may defend yourself against them. Chapter 9 opens on the day, the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month, and tells us about that day of extinction and talks about how the Jews fight for their protection across the kingdom. And so we'll pick up reading in Esther chapter 9, verse 16, which concludes the story here. And it says, but the other Jews that were in the king's provinces. So what it said before this was it told the story of the Jews in Shushan and the Jews here and here and here and here. And then it says, but the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives and had rest from their enemies and slew of their foes 75,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey on the 13th day of the month Adar. And on the 14th day of the same, rested they, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th day thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages that dwelled in the unwalled towns and made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and the 15th day of the same, yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of fasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the queen, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Wherefore they call these the days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, for all the words of this letter, and that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come upon them, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days, according to their writing, and according to their appointed time every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. Then Esther, the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. So that's the story, at least in basic form, as the Bible gives it, about the Feast of Purim. But what are we to make of all this? What are we to receive? What are we to learn from the Jews' Feast of Purim that occurred now 2,500 some years ago? The first lesson is the same lesson that Ken Beckley taught us back when he was here a couple weeks ago. That God uses ordinary people in everyday circumstances. Ordinary people like you and me, but also kings and queens in everyday circumstances. Now, we all have different spheres and areas of influence, different jobs, different people that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. Everybody's in a different position. Some people are kings and queens. If anybody here is a king or a queen, just let me know. Some people are presidents. Some people are Congress people. Some people are mayors. Some people are simply voters within a community. And that's on the political side of things. But in our day-to-day life, some people work at the grocery store. Some people work at the post office. Some people work here. Some people work at the hospital. Everybody works in a different place. Some people don't work at all. Some people do work. Some people have homes. Some people don't have homes. All across the vast spectrum of anything that you want to put in there, we're all ordinary people. But we all have various circumstances. In other words, your day-to-day and the day-to-day of kings and queens may be different than your day-to-day. But the reality is, everyone is to honor God in their day-to-day, in their circumstances, no matter what they are. In other words, just because we are all ordinary people, given abilities and given the, what's the word I wanted? We're given abilities, we're given positions of various degrees in various jobs and sectors, we are still within those circumstances to honor God. So whether it's Esther, the queen, or Mordecai, the Jew, just sitting in the king's gate, or Joe in the 127th province of the king, all three people, no matter where they are to honor God. Because God uses ordinary people in everyday circumstances. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two is this, that even in the most dire of circumstances, we are not to give up. Even in the most dire of circumstances, we are not to give up. If you consider maybe try and place yourself in the shoes of Esther or Mordecai back in that day, you might say, what on earth were they able to do? And if you consider, and maybe you've read a little bit about or understood a little bit about Xerxes and his kingdom and the authority and the power that he possessed. I mean, just one and you're dead. That's it. That's all it took. To come before the king was a big deal, was a major deal. And if you didn't come to the king in the right way and right manner that he wanted you to come, if he's just having a bad day, you're over. It doesn't matter if you're the queen or not. As we find out in chapter 1, when Vashti is deposed because she didn't do what he wanted her to do. And so now consider this great plot that Esther and Mordecai are facing and up against are up against. Not to mention all the Jews throughout all the kingdom are up against this. What on earth could they do? What abilities did they have? See, they could have looked at this threat and said, it's hopeless. What can we do? How could we change the king's mind? But instead of giving up and developing a hopeless attitude, both Mordecai and Esther determined to do this. We're going to do what we can do. Will we be successful? Who knows? But we're going to do it. We're going to try, at least. We're going to choose to do what they have the power to do. And so even in our lives today, even in the most dire of circumstances, and I'd say probably all of us could attest to the fact that we're not in the most dire of circumstances yet for us. Maybe you are. What should we do in those circumstances? Well, one, we should continue to seek wise counsel. What do we see Esther doing? She is seeking the counsel of Mordecai, and Mordecai is seeking the counsel of Esther. And the story doesn't tell us who else they sought to involve in this in their assistance, but even in the most dire circumstances, we're not to give up. We should seek wise counsel. And at the same time, we should continue to give wise counsel. The counsel that Mordecai gives to Esther, the counsel that Esther gives to Mordecai, and back and forth. And we're not given all the details of the story, although I'm sure we would love to have all those details laid out for us so we could know exactly what happened. And number three, this. We are to be obedient to what we know and what we have the power to do. In other words, even in the most dire of circumstances, we're not to give up. We are to do what is within our means. We are to use what is in our hands, what is within our power to use. It may not be much. You may not think it's anything. You might be like the 12 disciples and saying, we got a boy here with, 5 loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many? Just use it. Give it to God. See what God can do with it. Go before the king. See if God's not able to work a miracle and change things around. Number 3, we might learn from this story is this. God will deliver his people. God will deliver his people. The promise he gave all the way back in the beginning to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and even to those after them was this. I'm going to use you. I'm going to bring the seed of the woman into the world, the Messiah into the world through the people of Israel. And this story takes place, I can't remember the exact date, 467 BC, if I remember right off the top of my head. It's pretty close in there. In other words, 450 years before Christ ever comes on the scene, God's going to deliver his people because he promised, I'm going to bring the Messiah through this line, through the line of Judah. And it's a theme that God builds on over and over through the Old Testament into the New Testament, that God will use ordinary people in everyday circumstances that continue to do as they should in order to work all things together for the good of his people. That's what God does, day in and day out. He works things for the good of his people. Now, notice this. He didn't say that everything would be good for his people. In other words, you're not going to face only good things, but he works all things, even the most dire of circumstances, for your good. Kind of like the story of Joseph, where his brothers meant it for evil, that he would be sold into slavery and be gone, and that they present to their father that he is dead. They meant it as evil to get rid of their brother, and yet God was behind the scenes saying, oh, well, they meant it for evil, but I meant it for good. I intended to bring good out of this. Because had they not done that, how would Joseph have ended up in Egypt? And how would Joseph have been in the prison to interpret the dream and to all these things lining up? God using ordinary people in everyday circumstances. Haman meant for this story to be the end of the Jews. The 13th day of Adar, and all the Jews are dead. And Haman will rejoice. But what did God do? God used it as a reset for Israel, if you will. Because in just a few years later, this would spur the people into action. In the leadership of Nehemiah, and Ezra would take the people back to Jerusalem, and they would rebuild the walls of the city, and they would replace the gates, and they would rebuild the temple and get everything back in line. Then we have the second temple period leading up to Jesus. God will deliver his people. A fourth consideration is this. There should be thanksgiving in response. The institution of this Feast of Purim was all about, and is all about, giving thanks in remembrance of God's deliverance. Why? Because it's only fitting and right that those who God delivers should give him thanks in whatever manner they have available, with whatever's in their hands. It's only fitting that those who are saved from whatever calamity, whether they might be saved from a car accident, whether they may be saved from a fall, or whatever it might be, or maybe even saved from the extinction of an entire people group, it is only fitting and right that those people should be thankful to their Savior. And notice what happens in this story. They were not rejoicing and feasting and fasting because of Esther or because of Mordecai. They were feasting and fasting, and again, even though it doesn't explicitly say it, that God saved them. God delivered them. So the people recognized it, and the people knew it, that even though it seemed like God is invisible, his hand is formidable. And really, I think we should be careful to be thankful really about every moment of every single day, even in the hour that we've been sitting here. Because the reality is we're not able to see what's going on around us. Who knows what God has done in the hour we've been in here, that maybe he sent an angel to keep the driver on the road out here who was about to fall asleep to suddenly shock them awake, and so that they didn't crash into the building and hit the gas meter and explode the entire building and take us all. Who knows what could have happened that God was doing behind the scenes, even though we did not see it. The car accident we should have been in, the sickness we should have gotten, the death maybe we should have died. And yet, because God works through ordinary people in everyday circumstances to save us even when we are unaware of it, we should be thankful. What does the psalmist say? It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, that we're still here day by day. And number 5, The salvation of Israel in Esther's day is connected to the salvation of the whole world in Jesus' day. And I know this is sort of a hypothetical, if you will, but if Israel is not saved in the day of Esther, and they are all destroyed by Haman on the 13th day of Adar, then Jesus' birth never happens, because the lineage of the people is gone. Had Mordecai and Esther not stood up and opposed Haman in the only way available to them, had someone not seen the gallows that Haman had built, had someone had not heard about the plot that Haman had and brought it to Mordecai, Jesus' birth never would have happened. And I say that premised upon the fact that I understand God still could have worked in some way, form, or fashion, even if Haman's plot had gone through. God's able to work in that situation. He could have done something to save the Jews. But based on the story that we have in front of us, history was, in a way, resting on the shoulders of Mordecai and Esther. And you and I would not know the salvation of Jesus today had they not stepped up and done what was in their power and knowledge to do. And so I think today we need to consider, as a result of the Feast of Purim, there's not a whole lot that goes into Purim other than they spend 2 days fasting, feasting, rejoicing, and thanks, because God saved them. So today, in consideration of these thoughts, I believe we must consider what God desires for us to do by asking these questions. First is, are we being obedient and honoring to Him in the day-to-day, day by day, and with each passing moment? What are we doing? And are we doing it in light of Him? In the light of the circumstances around us that befall us, are we giving up hope? Or are we pushing forward with what we know to do? Because we can easily give up hope. That's the easy way out. The hard part is when everything is quiet or seems to be quiet. And the hard part is when God seems to be invisible and we don't know what God is doing. And God's not audibly told us what He's doing or written down what He's doing. And yet we know we should still be doing what? This, and this. And are we doing it? Have we stopped to give Him thanks for what He's done and what He might still do? Again, it's the whole feast is a time of thanksgiving and rejoicing. God delivered His people. Are we thanking Him for what He's done for us? That He delivered us? That He who knew no sin stepped down out of heaven to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in Him? Are we thanking Him for what He might do? There's an interesting one. What might God do? What could God do? Will we thank Him in advance for, God, we thank You that this might happen, or we thank You if this happens, and we'll thank You if this happens? Finally, who might God save because we choose to be obedient to Him, even in a day when it seems as though He is invisible? Now, I haven't been there in the past. I'm sure the time of Esther was a particularly dark time where it felt like God was invisible. And even today, with all the circumstances we face in our world, I know it certainly feels like at times, God, hello? Are you aware of what's going on? Did you see what just happened? God, are you not paying any attention? Even in a day when it seems like He might be invisible. When we choose to be obedient to Him and do what we have the knowledge to do what the Scriptures tell us to do, to act in the way the Bible tells us we should act, who might God be able to save? He might even be able to save an entire people group. In this story, the Jews. Could be your whole family. Who knows? Who knows what God could do? But you're not going to see what God can do if we aren't obedient to follow him and honor him and obey him day in and day out. Let's pray.